Welcome to Conversations from the World of Allergy, a podcast produced by the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology. I'm your host, Dave Stukas. I'm a board-certified allergist and immunologist and serve as the social media medical editor for the Academy. Our podcast series will use different formats to interview thought leaders from the world of allergy and immunology. This podcast is not intended to provide any individual medical advice to our listeners. We do hope that our conversations provide evidence-based information. Any questions pertaining to one's own health should always be discussed with their personal physician. The Find an Allergist search engine on the Academy website is a useful tool to locate a listing of board-certified allergists in your area. Finally, use of this audio program is subject to the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology Terms of Use Agreement, which you can find at www.FAAAAI.org. Today's edition of our Conversations from the World of Allergy podcast series is produced with the general public, patients, and healthcare professionals in mind. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Scott Sicherer, who is the director of the Elliott and Rosalind Jaffe Food Allergy Institute and the Elliott and Rosalind Jaffe Professor of Pediatric Allergy and Immunology at Mount Sinai. He is chief of the Division of Allergy and Immunology in the Department of Pediatrics and medical director of the Clinical Research Unit at Mount Sinai. Dr. Sicherer currently serves on the board of directors for the Academy and is an associate editor for the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology. He is an accomplished researcher with over 200 peer-reviewed publications, and his research interests include the epidemiology, natural history, and psychosocial aspects of managing food allergies. Dr. Sicherer, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, we're currently recording this during Food Allergy Awareness Week in May of 2019. Dr. Sicherer, in your opinion, what aspects related to food allergy cause the most misunderstanding among the general public?
That's a good question. I think one of the classic things that people have confusion about is that whole question of food allergy versus food intolerance, where allergy is the immune system, the part of the body that usually fights infection, getting riled up against the foods that we eat and causing illness, versus intolerance, which the classic is lactose intolerance, where it's a problem with digestion. So, for example, with milk, sugar, or lactose intolerance, there's deficiency of an enzyme, and people, if they ingest too much of that sugar, if they drink too much milk, for example, might get bloating or loose stools. Not a life-threatening situation, where allergy is more of a life-threatening situation potentially. So I think that's a common one. But I think the other thing that often is misunderstood in the community is the severity issues that people kind of will think, oh, gee, it's food allergy, so it's like a bother. They can't have some of this or eat it. But really, the idea that some people have reactions to even small amounts of the food or trace amounts of the food that could be potentially severe. So I think a lot of times people don't appreciate that part of it. And probably the biggest thing that's not appreciated is just how hard it is to live with a food allergy. It's different than a distaste for food or an intolerance, where if you make a mistake, nothing terrible would happen, but something bad can happen if you make a mistake with food allergy, and that leads to a lot of work for people living with this. And I think that a lot of times people misunderstand or don't appreciate all of what's involved in staying away from the food that you're allergic to.
So I agree, that's a common misunderstanding, and you did a nice job of separating the two between allergy and intolerance, but can you give our listeners a better sense of how severe a food allergy reaction can be and what some of the symptoms might look like?
Well, there are sort of two things going on. One is how sensitive somebody might be to the food. So some people might actually not get sick with a food allergy, might not get sick until they eat pretty substantial amount. And other people might react to even a small amount. The more typical symptoms that you might see are actually ones that aren't life-threatening. So rashes, like hives, welts on the skin, they look like mosquito bites, or maybe some flaring of pre-existing rashes like eczema flaring. There could be some stomach ache or vomiting. None of those are common symptoms, the skin and gut symptoms, but they're not typically intrinsically life-threatening. But then you can have symptoms in the respiratory tract, so breathing issues, throat tightness, trouble breathing, coughing, asthma-like symptoms, which could be much more life-threatening. And then circulation could be involved, so the heart pumping the blood around the body. This could be affected with low blood pressure, and people can get dizzy or confused, pass out, have low blood pressure, and between the respiratory and the circulation problems, that's where the life-threatening comes in.
And you mentioned that this can really impact somebody's life, and now we understand why because of the potential severity. Can you give us some insight into, what does this actually look like on a daily basis for somebody with a food allergy? How does that impact them?
So for listeners who aren't dealing with having to manage food allergies, you may not appreciate how much goes into this because it's like living in a landmine. Like think about how much everyone will do with eating each day. I mean, there's 3 meals a day, but there's also snacks. So if every meal means that you have to start thinking, how is this prepared? Does it have the ingredients in it that I'm avoiding? And then think about how we live our lives with social activities, and almost everything that we do or children will do surrounds around food. So whether it's a birthday party or Thanksgiving or holidays like Christmas or New Year's parties, birthday parties, it's just the list goes on, and almost everything that we do socially has to do with eating. Now take that back and think everything I put in my mouth, where did the person who make this for me, do they know about the allergies? Could they have accidentally gotten an ingredient in there? Am I going to have an allergic reaction? Is it safe for me to eat this? I have to read these ingredient labels. There's just a lot that will go into safety in terms of avoiding the food. And the other associated topic with that is what to do if you do have symptoms, how to treat those.
And would you say, in your experience and opinion in working with these patients and families, can this negatively impact somebody's quality of life?
Well, we did some of the first studies on quality of life, and there have been many studies showing how food allergy can reduce basically quality of life, and it goes back to what I was discussing, just the amount of work that goes into keeping yourself safe from accidentally ingesting the food, all of the different circumstances surrounding that. It just takes a lot of energy, and sometimes people will avoid circumstances where they would potentially be socializing or getting the foods that might be an issue for them. So there's an incredible impact on quality of life.
Now, to go back to some of the struggles with management that you mentioned, can you touch upon some of the issues that are more pertinent for toddlers compared to school-age children and then adolescents or adults? Because I'm sure that this varies dramatically.
It does, and I think about what I would be saying to a family as I'm educating them in my office practice. And when someone is coming in with very young children, it's really all about the caregivers, making sure that they understand how to make safe meals, how to avoid cross contact, which means for example, you put the knife into the peanut butter and then put it into the jelly jar, and now the jelly jar has peanut in it, and the next time someone goes to that jar, it's been cross contacted with the allergen, and they have to worry about it. So with that and hidden ingredients, so the idea that something you wouldn't think has a food in it that you were avoiding, but it turns out that it can because it's in a sauce or it's just a minor ingredient that you didn't think about, or that someone else prepared the food and it may not be safe, or that you have to carefully read the labels. All of these aspects really also include people who are going to be taking care of young children. So it's grandparents, it's babysitters, it's whoever may be providing food or supervising an infant or a toddler. Toddlers also can grab things, so it's a great fun age, but they also have to worry that if they're near other children who are eating something that they're not allowed to eat, are they going to just grab it? Because of course they're not going to have the judgment for that. So I'll have those types of discussions with families with the young children. As the children get a little bit older, I'm telling families more about what would be the responsibility of a young child who doesn't really know anything about reading or anything like that, but they for example might understand that they have an allergy where they can eat food, let's say, by someone who they know knows what's safe for them. So I might explain to that family that they would say, well, grandma and your teacher Sally know what, and mom and dad know what foods are okay for you, but other people don't. So that the young child is just thinking about who they're getting the food from. But as they get into grade school, I have conversations about letting the child partner in getting their safe food and also carrying medications, or at least understanding the medications. So as children learn to read, they can take a first shot at reading ingredient labels and under their family supervision, of course, and kind of participate in the process of making sure their foods are safe. And then it's a completely different discussion as the children start to get older. When the children can start to speak up more for themselves, I want them to, understand about their allergies, so that, for example, if the family's going to a restaurant, the child can start the conversation with the uh, staff in the restaurant, and then maybe the family can carry on to do more details of it. And with teenagers now, I would hope that by that age they have done more transitioning to understand, how to talk to restaurants, to understand how to make sure that their peers know about their allergies. But I'll throw the parents out of the room and have conversations with teenagers about kissing. In other words, if the person that they're kissing was eating the food that they're allergic to, and then they're mouth-to-mouth kissing, that would be an issue. I'm not worried about kiss on the cheek, but just mouth-to-mouth kissing in that case. I will talk to teenagers about alcohol, because that could impair their judgment, and they might eat something they weren't going to eat otherwise, or it actually can make reactions worse, sort of potentiate reactions, and that's an issue. Also have the, drugs isn't is not a good thing either, but in terms of the food allergy, for them to make sure that they are carrying their medications, hopefully have medical identification jewelry, or at least have their phone set so that it's easily accessible for a health app, so that people could see, what allergies they might have if they got into trouble. So the conversations and the instructions really change, but they kind of do so in a gradual process over the life course.
So that's a great description of that, and it sounds to me like you're really promoting active involvement of children from a very young age, both in understanding their food allergy and what a reaction will look like, but also in reading labels and communicating with others. Is
And
that
I
something
think
that you routinely do?
Yeah, and I think parents appreciate and expect that as well. But sometimes a family might get into a pattern of just having the parents take over all of the aspects of ensuring the child's safety, and forget that they should be including them. We had actually surveyed allergists and surveyed parents about when the time would be for giving the child increasing responsibility. And interestingly, parents came up with ages that were even younger than allergists were thinking. So even as young as 7, 8, 9, 10, to have more responsibilities. But I think it's going to be different for each child, and so it's individualized. But yeah, a gradual increase in responsibility makes a lot of sense.
And we know that when food allergies are diagnosed, they're being diagnosed by a whole range of physicians and providers among different levels. It's not just allergists that have access to especially blood food allergy testing. So, do you have any advice in regards to, when a child is first diagnosed with food allergy, regardless of who's making the diagnosis, what education should be provided to the family at that visit?
I think I didn't speak much yet about treatment aspects, and recognition of symptoms and how to treat them is very important. It might be beyond the scope of this podcast to go into in depth, but basically recognizing symptoms that would warrant using epinephrine, self-injectable epinephrine, promptly as first aid management. So what I'll usually do with a family with new diagnosis is to give them some examples of scenarios where they would inject self-injectable epinephrine and get to the emergency room for further care. I am careful to separate the notion there, because a lot of times families will walk away with the idea of, well, if you give epinephrine, it's tied to going to an emergency room, almost as if the epinephrine is dangerous in some way. But epinephrine, as you know, helps the more severe symptoms, opens up the airway for breathing, and makes the blood circulation strong, and gives you time to get to the emergency room. So I separate those concepts, that epinephrine has a lot of advantages, that it makes you feel better quickly, and that using it early makes it less likely that you're going to need more doses or end up staying in the hospital or anything like that, but that you're going to the emergency room for more care. And I'll go through what the mild symptoms are and what the more severe symptoms are, and when they would use their epinephrine, and how to use other medications like antihistamines, or asthma medications. And those latter medicines, the antihistamines and asthma medications, of course, are not the primary treatment for severe allergic reaction or anaphylaxis. And then I'll make sure that they're comfortable with that by giving little vignettes. And then the second thing that's important, I think, with the new diagnosis is going through avoidance issues, which, as I've already alluded to, involves age-based instructions, and issues about restaurants and label reading and hidden ingredients and cross contact. But I think that a third component that sometimes is overlooked is just general counsel. especially with a new diagnosis, it's a lot to take in one visit. And there's a lot of anxiety that comes up and a lot of things to talk about. And I think it's really helpful for a family to sort of get some of that starter information, but then go home, make a list of questions, and then have a follow-up visit where they can really go through more details. Understanding, that I think there's a lot about um, uh, things that make people worry about casual exposure, like what if I'm near the food I'm allergic to, or what if I smell it? And I think early conversations about focusing on avoidance of ingestion, that eating the food is the main way that you would end up with an allergic reaction, and talking about that compared to accidentally touching a food that you're allergic to, and that's not likely to lead to any severe reactions. I think that helps with some of the general counseling of living day to day with food allergy without being overly impacted in ways that would be more than what's necessary.
That sounds like a lot to cover in one visit.
It is, which is why I said the second visit, and also giving people information about resources is important as well.
No, I love that point. Thank you for bringing that up. Vetted resources are extremely helpful so they can find information after that visit. And then just quickly, about how often do you think somebody with a food allergy, say they have no other chronic conditions and it's just food allergy, how often should they return for monitoring or counseling or anticipatory guidance?
Well, from a technical standpoint, I think it's how often are you going to test somebody is often the question that the family is thinking. And I think we often will do repeated testing more often in the younger age group. So if we're seeing people in the first 2 or 3 years of life, we're doing something maybe every 6 months or annually. Whereas if you have someone who's maybe 10, 12, 14 years old, you may not really need to do testing every year, and you could probably spread that out more. But to answer your question, I recommend a yearly visit, even for families where things aren't changing that much, because there's always so many questions that people have that, and they don't realize that just having the visit really gives you time to address the day-to-day issues. I mean, you're living every single day with a food allergy. Even a once-a-year visit with a doctor isn't a lot of time to talk about what happens all the rest of the year. So at minimum, I do recommend a yearly visit. And as I mentioned, for a new diagnosis, I think it's important to have a sort of a follow-up, more comprehensive visit. And as you alluded to, a lot of times the first diagnosis is made by the pediatrician or general practitioner. And then that also can give the allergist the opportunity to let that clean up in a way and spend some more time talking about all the many questions. I totally encourage patients to make lists. Like I applaud it when people come in with several pages of questions. It actually makes it so much more organized and can approach what people want to really understand better.
Great tips, and we really covered a lot so far in regards to how challenging it is not only to diagnose food allergy but to manage it as well. And if it's okay with you, what I'd like to do is really get into some specific scenarios because I think that people listening might really benefit from some of the details that aren't always covered in other areas.
Sure.
So, summer offers a break from the daily routine that the school year brings. There's often summer camps involved or changes to the schedule. In your opinion, what areas of food allergy management are at greatest risk of falling by the wayside during this transition to a different summer schedule?
Well, I think you just actually touched on them in asking me the question. So, if someone is starting a summer camp, whether if it's a day camp, for example, now you are in a place where it's all potentially new people. There's also often younger supervisory individuals. The camp counselor is often someone who might just be 15, 16, 17 years old themselves and may not know that much. Most or many camps will have either more of an older adult or maybe a nurse or some other healthcare professional who may be overseeing certain things, but it is a transition that's worth having a discussion before you start in terms of how will the child be getting safe foods and who's going to be watching and being able to potentially recognize and treat an allergic reaction. And I think nowadays a lot of camps and schools, for that matter, have already experienced having a lot of children who have food allergies. There can always be variations in the number of foods or types of foods or severity of the allergies, but in general, they usually will have some plans to talk about. But again, with travel, then you're talking about, or actually, I should say, for overnight camps, it's a whole other ball game, so to speak, because now it's much more likely that the camp is going to have to be providing the food for the child as opposed to just a bagged lunch type of scenario where you can potentially take the food variable out of the story in some cases. But if a child's getting many or all of their meals from the camp, then there's a lot more conversation that would have to go on with the food staff. Again, hopefully for many camps they're already somewhat familiar, but depending again on the allergies, some conversation in advance of signing up for camp would be my advice to make sure that everyone is comfortable with providing a safe food, that the people will know to identify what's safe and how to prepare foods that are safe from cross contact and don't have the allergens that the child is at risk from. So all of this takes preparation. And camping, you're in more remote locations, and I like to throw in that when you're traveling far or in areas where you're farther from medical help, it's all the more important to make sure that your food source is safe. You're not going to want to try to eat something that you have never tried before, or maybe depend on someone who is naive in making foods. So there's a lot more, I think, attention to making sure that the food is safe to begin with, because there could be a delay in getting to help.
So, while we're talking about summer camp, in your opinion and experience, is there a safe pathway or a blueprint that families can follow as long as they have appropriate conversations and planning and preparation where kids with food allergy can happily attend summer camp?
Oh yeah, I think there are some summer camps that specifically cater to food allergic individuals, but I don't. I mean, I think those camps are great, but I think that a child should go to the summer camp that they want to go to, and hopefully that particular camp, even if it's just any general camp, would be able to provide a safe environment. It just takes some additional preparation, and I give similar advice for starting school or changing schools. I think it makes sense to sit down with the camp personnel who are in charge, basically. So whether it's the director or a camp nurse or the food services in the camp in advance, just basically start the conversation with what do you do for children who have food allergies. I prefer that start than compared to gathering a whole bunch of lists of things that that a family might want the camp to do, but rather to ask what does the camp do? How has their experience been doing it? Have a prior children had the food allergies that are similar to the camper that the conversation is happening around, and just see what they have to say about their past experiences. If there have been any issues, how they've addressed them, what the camp day looks like for their sensitivity to somebody who has a food allergy, who would need to have safe meals and access to medications if necessary. What happens if they're taking trips off site? Who would be responsible for, again, making sure that the meals are safe and for recognizing and treating any reactions. And I think nowadays many of the camps are already going to have those answers ready and know what they've been doing, and then there could be a conversation around any details that are concerning. And hopefully, in most cases, it's possible to make a safe scenario for the child, but everyone has to be comfortable with it.
Sure. And as you mentioned, there's a lot to think through, which will be individualized based upon the family and the child and the camp preparation. So that's great. That's some good insight for everybody listening. Now, we also know that during the summer, a lot of people travel and take vacations. Can you offer some tips to help people with food allergies travel safely, particularly if they're going to go on an airplane?
Sure. So, this is a big part of our conversations. This is being recorded in May, Food Allergy Awareness Week, and we're heading toward the summer season, and people are definitely preparing for their summer vacations and travels, which means airlines. And there is a lot of anxiety about traveling with food allergy on an airplane, and that's understandable. You're locked in a metal box essentially away from emergency rooms, and the food that you're going to eat on that plane has to be safe, and there are concerns along those lines. So I guess it's important, first of all, to make sure that for any time you're anywhere, to have the correct medications available, know how to use them, have them up to date, the prescriptions up to date, and if you're traveling, then having extra on hand. So if you did have to use something, you'd have backup so that you wouldn't have to worry like, oh, how am I going to get prescription filled now? I'm far away, from my home base, and how do I contact people? So it's better to have, some backups with you. The airplane is an issue for the reasons I mentioned before in terms of the anxiety that people might have being kind of locked away from help in essence. But it just, I think, is primarily, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. The main way that someone's going to have a significant allergic reaction is by ingestion of the food. So it's incredibly important when you're traveling, including actually on the airplane, to have a safe source of the food. The airplane wouldn't be a place where you would say, "Hey, I never tried this nut before. Let me try it here," because they served it. That would probably not be a good idea for someone who's prone to allergy to try something new on an airplane. I know that sounds a little ridiculous, but it's just a basic thing. Is if I've never tried some food before, now's not the time to try it when I'm prone to allergies. You can bring foods with you. You can bring some safe foods. You can contact the airline in advance to make sure that the meals would be safe. But I think the biggest thing is about making sure that what you're actually putting in your mouth is going to be safe. And there's a lot of concern about, in an airplane being near other people who are eating the foods, that there could be residual food proteins on the tray table or seat. So for younger kids in particular, my main concern would be that sure there might be people who've eaten some allergens on the seat before and it wasn't cleaned well. If you have a 10-year-old, they're probably not going to be, and again I don't mean to exaggerate, but they're not potentially going to be licking the tray table or licking the seat or something like that. Whereas, a younger child might be in every square inch. Like little kids are going to be squirmy. They're going to be rolling all around. They might be on the floor of the plane. So you'd want to at least wipe off the tray table, wipe off the seat for the younger kids. Some people will put a blanket out and cover that way. The types of reactions that would be possible in that scenario, and I think in most people's experiences would be just contact reactions. So like if there's residual of nuts or peanut and you're wearing shorts or a skirt for a young child and the leg is rubbing on it, it might get red. Again, I wouldn't expect any kind of anaphylactic reaction typically from that. When people are eating foods on the airplane, it's not typically strongly airborne, meaning the concentration in the air is not particularly high. I wouldn't expect much to happen from that either. And again, anaphylaxis would be, I think, very unlikely in that setting. But just wiping the tray table, actually pre-boarding, asking for pre-boarding could be helpful so that you can get on a little bit early and wipe off the tray table and seat. Put down your blanket if you want to. Make sure that the source of food is going to be appropriate. Some airlines, and you can actually check, I believe Food Allergy Research and Education and Allergic Living Magazine, other sources will have lists of what the airline accommodations may be for different airlines. That could be checked on if a family is concerned about this. We did some early studies, not on an airplane, where we had peanut butter with the children who had very high IG levels to peanut. About a third of the families had indicated that they found that their child had a reaction just being around the food. And we had, it was what's called a double-blind study, where we have people sniff something that was really peanut butter and another thing that was fake peanut butter, so it smelled like it, but it wasn't. And of 30 children, we had them sniff for 10 minutes. No one reacted to the real peanut butter. Actually, one child had trouble breathing with the fake peanut butter, but it was an anxiety response. So various studies have shown that, at least from peanut butter, there's not a lot of protein. There's pretty much no detectable protein that comes off of the peanut butter, even though you can smell it. It's not the protein in the air. It's the organic matter that people smell. And we also did studies where we would just touch people with peanut butter, and the typical thing is either nothing happens with intact skin or they get a little red in that area, but anaphylaxis, is not something that would be expected. So if we turn all of that back to getting into the airplane, I think it's perfectly fine to call ahead. It's perfectly fine to, ask for some accommodations that many of the airlines give. But at the end of the day, it's making sure you have a safe food supply, that you wipe off the seat and tray table for the younger kids, and for the most part, you should be able to enjoy a safe flight. In terms of arriving, it's pretty much like going to a restaurant throughout your stay. And so, the same types of practices that I tell my patients about for safe restaurant eating is a lot of what I emphasize when I talk about vacation planning.
And we're going to touch about that in 1 second. But I'd like to kind of summarize what you said because there's a lot of great information in there, and ask you one follow-up question.
Mhm.
It sounds like essentially the same management strategies apply when you're in the air as what you would do when you're on the ground, but the obvious concern being if you're 30,000 feet in the air in a constricted space, that if a reaction were to occur, that it may not be adequately treated or you may not be able to have access to the kit that you would need. Do you think that that sounds fair?
Yes.
Okay. And then, thank you. And you mentioned the wipes. Could you clarify, is it, a damp washcloth, or are there certain wipes that are better than others at removing food proteins?
I think it more has to do with some wetness and elbow grease than anything else. So I'm not talking about major cleaning, but having some wet wipes to be able to just wipe down the areas for the younger kids again in case there's residue that should help.
Okay, thank you. Now, if we can, let's go back to the restaurants because I think that's another area of concern, an obvious concern. I know a lot of people with food allergies may even not dine out at all due to concern for potential reactions. But what are some of the best practices that you discuss with people with food allergies to allow them to dine out safely?
My suggestions to families actually come from a study that we did a while back, where we went into restaurants and we asked waiters, the managers, and the chefs how they felt about being able to provide safe meals for people with food allergies. And for the most, I mean, obviously, no restaurant wants to make anyone sick, so everyone is definitely looking out for their food allergic customer. However, when we asked them if they could provide safe meals, we had very high rates of people saying yes, we could, we can guarantee safe meals. But then when we asked them simple questions like, can you take the nuts off of the salad? We found fairly high rates of the restaurant staff saying yes, that's okay, or they thought that high heat broke down the food protein. So they had a number of misconceptions, and I don't think that they're it could be depended upon that they're going to know all the nuances that a family might be aware of. So using that information, I'll instruct families to educate the restaurant staff as they ask questions or describe the allergy. Now, the specific issues, differ somewhat depending on what you're allergic to. But let's say, for example, someone's allergic to peanuts, and actually, let's say someone's allergic to peanut. I'll have them say that they're allergic to peanut and tree nut because I think it's just easier to work that way. So let's say you have someone who's allergic to peanut, then I would have them say, I'm allergic to peanuts and tree nuts. A small amount could make me sick. So why do I have them say that? Because even if a small amount doesn't make that particular person sick, I have them say it that way because it just starts to trigger this idea that that the restaurant staff has to think about that tiny amounts are a problem. And I might have them say trace amounts can make me sick. So the next thing is that I have them give some examples of cross contact. So for example, it would sound like this. So you can't be picking nuts or peanuts off my salad. You can't be chopping nuts or peanuts and chopping the food that I'm going to eat. And if you're making me a vanilla milkshake, but you spin peanut butter milkshakes in the same machine, that's no good. So those are some examples of cross contact. And then the other concept is about hidden ingredients. So they're when someone's making something in the restaurant, it could have been prepared days before. It may have ingredients that that the waiter may not even be aware of. So in that scenario, I'll have them give the examples. So if there's peanuts or tree nuts in a crust or sauce, that could make me sick. So if I put all of that together, it would sound like this. I have a peanut and tree nut allergy. A small amount could send me to the emergency room, even a trace amount. So I have to be really careful. You can't be picking nuts off of my salad. You can't be chopping nuts or peanuts in the same place you're making my food. You can't spin my vanilla milkshake in a machine that does peanut milkshakes. And if peanuts or tree nuts are some minor ingredient in your sauces or crusts, I'm going to end up in the emergency room. So that took me, I think, less than about 20 seconds, but it gave some specific examples of the key things that the restaurant may not have thought about. I actually suggest to my patients that they not rely on the description of the food or assumptions about the food based on what they might see on a menu, but rather make sure that they talk about, these exact circumstances. So for families, you had mentioned earlier that there's some families that may not want to go to restaurants at all, and I certainly come across families like that. But I do have conversations with them because I have patients who are avoiding some really tough to avoid foods. Milk is probably the most difficult, and you can imagine, as an example, if there's a restaurant that has chicken soup, but they also have a cream soup, and at some point they put the ladle from the cream soup into the chicken soup. Now they've gotten milk into the chicken. I say that I may have mixed that up, but if they put the ladle from the cream soup into the chicken soup at some point, and then you're ordering the chicken soup, it has milk in it now, and that's going to be a problem. So for people who have allergies to certain foods, I give them different examples to be able to talk to the restaurant about. And for people who have multiple allergies, I'll give them advice on how to instruct the restaurant to make the food safely for them. So I'll give you an example of that. Let's say, we know that the child could have baked potato, broccoli, and hamburger, beef, but they're allergic to milk and egg and fish and a variety of other things. So in that case, I think that directing the restaurant, assuming they can do this, to prepare the food in a specific way is helpful. So again, you still would tell them about the allergies, you still would tell them about the small amounts making you sick and all that. But then I would say, for my baked potato, just wash the potato, wrap it in clean tin foil, put that in the oven. For my hamburger, you're going to make it on a grill, but there's been other things on the grill, cheeseburgers and everything else. Take a clean piece of tin foil. You can put some, vegetable oil on it. But if you use butter, I'm going to be sick. If the hamburger is made with fresh ground beef and there's no other fillers in it, because fillers would be a problem. If that happened, and I don't want that hamburger, but if it's going to be, just ground beef and nothing else, then you're going to cook that on my tin foil so it doesn't, touch anything else that's on that grill. I'm going to have broccoli. You're going to steam it. If someone decides it looks dry and they're going to put butter on it on the way to the table, that's a problem. So got to just steam it straight. And you're going to bring these things to me, without additional sauces or anything, and I'll add my own salt and pepper. So by directing the restaurant more specifically, for someone who has multiple food allergies, that's the way that I advise going.
Okay, that was a lot, which is great, and I really like the approach of offering specific details and conversation points for people to practice. Before we move on to the last sort of specific scenario, can you just comment for our listeners and discuss the differences in peanut oil? Because I know there's a lot of concern about somebody with peanut allergy eating in a restaurant in which they may use peanut oil.
Sure. So there are different types of ways that oils can be made. So for peanut oil, there could be an extruded oil where basically you're squeezing the oil out of peanuts, and that's going to carry with it protein, and it's pretty much the same as eating peanut protein, which is what people are allergic to. There are also highly processed oils, refined oils that are just the fat from the food and doesn't have the protein in it. So a highly refined peanut oil technically should be safe for people with peanut allergy, but because in restaurants in particular, it's often difficult to know which one you're getting, and the problem oil is sometimes chosen in for more flavor. I will advise most of my patients to avoid peanut oil just so that they don't get confused with that. Soy oil is typically only the highly refined type, so for soy allergy, soy oil is usually okay. But a lot of the other oils, like nut oils and such, we do worry about the protein. That protein is in there.
Okay, so oils sound like they need to be discussed with one's personal allergist and really tease out what that looks like.
Well, I would probably expand to almost everything I've been talking about is good to review with your personal allergist.
I would echo that as well. So that's an excellent point for us to remind everybody that we're not offering individual medical advice on this podcast, and that these are talking points, and certainly food allergy management is not one size fits all. So I think that's a good reminder. Thanks. Okay, so let's go back to something you briefly touched upon as our last topic. We're talking how we're recording this early or at the end of the school year for 2019, and summer's just beginning. But before we know it, kids will be going back to school. You mentioned earlier about some talking points for families who are sending their child to school. Can you touch upon some of the things they should discuss with a child's new teacher or school, and some of the most important things for them to consider?
So a lot of this again falls into the whether the school is new, whether the scenario is new for the child, the age of the child, things are so much different for the a 6-year-old versus a 16-year-old. So a lot of the discussions are going to be very different depending on all those different circumstances. But I think at the end of the day, there if it's a new discussion, it's what I mentioned earlier. I recommend to my patients to start out with asking the right people in the school how they've managed food allergy in the past. 20 years ago, it was a lot different. I totally supported families coming in with a list of things that they needed to do because the schools weren't so familiar. But nowadays, most, not all, but most schools have experienced children with food allergies before, and they have some approaches and policies and things that are usually very reasonable, and just understanding what they do and how it's gone in the past. But an individual child may have particular issues that have to also be reviewed. The developmental abilities of a particular child, even at any given age, may differ. You might have a child who's more apt to grab food from someone, discussing what the day looks like, who's going to be supervising, how the medication is going to be available. So preferably in an unlocked area where it's easily accessible and promptly accessible, and that there's someone who can recognize and treat the reactions so that it's not dependent upon that the child of any age would be the only one either carrying or self-injecting epinephrine, for example. Um, there should be some conversations about any school trips or how they would be managed. Craft projects for younger kids or parties that they can involve food, and so if there are substitutions that people can make, so that it's not all about the food all of the time, or that there would be safe snacks available. Those are all important to think about. For the younger kids, I mentioned craft projects with food. Finger paints might be smoothed with egg whites, or people might be deciding to use foods in different craft projects. Usually, you can substitute something that the child's not allergic to. You'd find something else to do. Um, there's sometimes there's a substitute teacher. How would the information about the child having the allergy be transferred if there's a substitute teacher that day? Um, I'm running out of additional things, but
No, no,
those are but those are those. There's a whole long potential laundry list of things to think about. But again, I would start with finding out what the school usually does. But you want to make sure that the food supply is going to be safe, the activities are going to be safe, that the child's going to have a way of having any reactions identified and treated promptly. So those are the basic things.
And I think going back to this is how one's personal allergist can certainly help families really figure out the talking points and areas of discussion as you sort of highlighted. As a general rule, when would you recommend that families begin to have that conversation with the school? How far prior to the onset of the school year? And then do you make any recommendations in regards to them touching base again once school starts?
Well, I think the answers are implied in the questions. You definitely wouldn't want to start a conversation after your child already was in the school. So usually, and also most of the schools are going to be not have the personnel there over the summer. So you're probably going to want to look at the end of the previous school year at the latest to start that conversation. Most people will be best off probably to touch base with the school even a year in advance, just to make sure that they're comfortable with everything. Again, it's unusual nowadays to have a school that hasn't experienced something with food allergy before, so there should be some things in place. Making sure that you're going in with the right paperwork too, so the emergency plan that the allergist or pediatrician would provide, the medications, making sure that they can take the medications and have a place to keep it for the child and review that as well. So there are a lot of potential steps, but it should not be anything that would be too problematic.
And thanks for bringing up the paperwork because, as I'm sure you'll agree, I can attest that August is a very challenging time of the year to fill out paperwork for all of our patients. So get the papers in early to your allergist or pediatrician so they can help fill it out.
And get those prescriptions refilled so you have a set of, or at least one or more auto injectors.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Sicherer, thank you again for taking the time to be with us today. I think this was a great and very helpful conversation. Before we depart, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
I would add two things. One is I mentioned earlier that there are a lot of resources, food allergy research and education, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Allergy, of course, and the college. There's the Consortium of Food Allergy Research that also has a website with educational materials. It's under cofargroup.org. That includes some materials that were validated in the study in terms of educational materials. So I would suggest that listeners take a look at those types of materials and other of the good stuff that's on the internet. You had mentioned vetted materials on the internet, so what I just mentioned are examples of vetted materials. The other thing I would say is that we touched on a lot of areas that have to do with nuances, and everybody's different. So for my I get referrals of children who have multiple food allergies and multiple allergic problems, and every patient is different. And so, when I'm in the office with the family, we individualize our discussions and have very deep discussions about different issues. I'm very sensitive. For example, we didn't talk about bullying. Children with food allergies have a higher rate of bullying. I talk about those issues. Some children are more sensitive to foods than others, and so the casual exposure issues should be discussed. A lot of times families are particularly worried about that area. We just did a study where we talked about, we just did a study where we looked at families where they were very concerned about casual exposure, and by that I mean being near the allergen. And that comes up in all of the scenarios we talked about, whether you're in school or traveling on an airplane or whatnot. I mentioned before that most serious allergic reactions would happen from ingestion, not from just being near, smelling, or touching the allergen. So in our study, we did a randomization. So half the kids who were nervous about casual exposure who went to the study were randomized to touch the allergen that they were allergic to. And no one had a reaction to that, but they just touched it with their finger. And then the other half, we just gave educational information about it, kind of like I did earlier in this podcast. And it turned out that just talking about it was very, very helpful. And both groups had an improvement in their quality of life and reduced anxiety about those types of experiences just from talking about it, even without doing the demonstration of them touching it. So I think my bottom line is talk to your allergist. If you have concerns about these things, something that you're worrying about, reading about, that's making it harder to live your life with food allergy, it's really important to discuss that with your allergist, because the specific thing that's applicable to you or your child may be different than what you're hearing about from the general public, things that are in the newspapers and things. It's different experience for different people. So that would be my parting words.
Okay. I think those are great parting words. And Dr. Sicherer, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed listening to today's episode. Please visit www.faaai.org for show notes and any pertinent links from today's conversation. If you like the show, please take a moment to subscribe to our podcast through iTunes or Google Play so you can receive new episodes in the future. Thank you again for listening.